I remember exactly where I was standing when my husband of 25 years became a stranger. In our kitchen, the one with sea green tiles we'd picked together, holding a letter addressed to someone named Daniel Morrison. My husband's name was David Miller. At least, that's who I thought I'd married. They say at 62, you should know who you are. I certainly thought I did. Elaine Miller, retired high school librarian, grandmother to twins, wife to David, the steady-handed architect who'd loved me through my mother's passing, my breast cancer scare, and the endless, ordinary days that string together to make a life. We met at 47, both of us with failed marriages behind us, both convinced we'd never find love again. He'd appeared at my library fundraiser with an architect's proposal for the new wing. I noticed his hands first, how they moved with such certainty across the blueprints, how they belonged to someone who built things meant to last. Architecture is just honesty in 3 dimensions, he'd said when I asked what he loved about his work. I fell for him that evening, watching him speak about light and space with reverence. By our 3rd date, when he reached for my hand across a restaurant table and confessed he'd been alone too long, I knew this was different. "Let's not waste time," he'd said. "We're old enough to know what matters." Within a year, we were married in my sister's backyard, surrounded by late summer hydrangeas and friends who'd witnessed our separate lives and now celebrated our joined one. There was no grand honeymoon, just a weekend at a lakeside cabin where we stayed up talking until dawn. His first marriage had ended after 10 childless years. Caroline wanted different things, was all he'd say. He'd moved from Philadelphia to our small Connecticut town for a fresh start. His parents had passed years before. He had no siblings. Sometimes I'd catch a shadow crossing his face when the past came up, but I attributed it to the natural melancholy of a man who'd been lonely. Our life together was beautifully ordinary. He designed homes while I helped teenagers discover books that might change their lives. We saved for retirement, planted perennials, and called each other during the day just to share small observations. When my daughter from my first marriage had twins, we became grandparents together, though they weren't his blood. He loved those boys fiercely, building them elaborate tree houses and teaching them to draw. After retirement, we settled into new rhythms. Volunteer work at the community center, Wednesday night movies, Sunday crosswords on the porch. David took up woodworking, crafting delicate jewelry boxes he said reminded him of me, beautiful things that hold treasures. 25 years of inside jokes and comfortable silences. 25 years of knowing the landscapes of each other's bodies, even as they changed with age. 25 years of believing I knew this man completely. Until the day I didn't. The letter arrived on an ordinary Tuesday. I'd just returned from my water aerobics class, hair still damp, when I sorted through our mail. Bill, catalog, charity request, and then a thick cream envelope with a Philadelphia postmark. Daniel Morrison, 47, Oakwood Lane. Our address, not my husband's name. I placed it on David's desk, thinking it was a simple mistake. But something about that envelope nagged at me, the formal stationery, the handwritten address. That evening, I mentioned it casually over dinner. Mail came for someone named Daniel Morrison today. Same address. The change was subtle but unmistakable, a tightening around his eyes, the slightest pause before he reached for his water glass. "Probably just a mix-up with the postal service," he said, voice carefully neutral. "I'll take care of it." Later that night, I woke to an empty bed. Downstairs, a thin band of light shone from beneath his workshop door. Through the window, I saw him sitting at his workbench, but he wasn't crafting anything. The letter was open before him, and his shoulders curved inward like a man carrying something heavy. When he raised his head, the grief on his face stole my breath. I didn't confront him then. Something told me this wasn't a moment for questions, but for quiet observation. I returned to bed and lay awake until he joined me hours later, his body a careful distance from mine. The next morning, I drove to the library where I'd spent 30 years of my working life. Marge, the head librarian who'd once been my assistant, greeted me with surprise. "Elaine." What brings you in so early? Research, I said with a smile that felt stiff on my face. Just a little project. In the quiet privacy of a computer station, I typed Daniel Morrison, Philadelphia into the search bar. Thousands of results, of course. I added architect on a hunch. The screen filled with articles from the 1990s. A promising young architect, award-winning designs for a riverfront development. And then a headline that made my heart stutter. Architect Daniel Morrison still missing after embezzlement scandal. I clicked through article after article, each one a blow to everything I thought I knew. Daniel Morrison had been investigated for embezzling nearly $2 million from his firm's client accounts in 1997. Before charges could be filed, he had disappeared. The case had gone cold. The money had never been recovered. A photo accompanied one article, grainy but clear enough. A younger version of my husband, with darker hair and without the glasses he now wore daily, but unmistakably David. Unmistakably Daniel. I printed nothing, took no notes. Some secrets demand to be carried carefully. That evening, I watched David or whoever he was prepare dinner, his movements as familiar to me as my own. The way he diced onions with precise, even strokes. How he hummed tunelessly while stirring sauce. 25 years of intimate knowledge suddenly rendered unreliable. I was thinking about taking a trip to Philadelphia, I said, the words dropping into our kitchen like stones. I haven't been since college. What do you think? His knife paused mid-chop. A moment's hesitation before he resumed, rhythm slightly off. Why Philadelphia? His voice sounded normal, but I knew better. Just feeling nostalgic, I'd guess. Sometimes it's good to revisit the past. He looked up then, and in his eyes, I saw something I'd never witnessed before: fear. Elaine, he said softly, setting down his knife. We need to talk. We sat across from each other at our kitchen table, the place where we'd shared thousands of meals, planned vacations, discussed our days. Now it felt like an interrogation room, with the overhead light casting harsh shadows across his familiar face. I'm not David Miller, he began, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. I haven't been David Miller for 26 years. Before that, I was Daniel Morrison. I said nothing, letting the confession fill the space between us. I didn't steal the money, he continued, but I was going to take the blame for someone who did. The story unfolded like a novel I couldn't put down. In Philadelphia, he'd been a rising star at an architectural firm, engaged to Caroline Wright, the daughter of the firm's founder. He discovered financial irregularities, large sums disappearing from client accounts, and traced them to Caroline's father, Howard Wright, who had gambling debts and a lifestyle that outpaced even his considerable income. Howard was like a father to me, David, Daniel said. My own father died when I was in college. When I confronted Howard, he broke down completely. Said he'd pay it all back, that no one would get hurt. But an audit was coming. Howard had begged for time, promised to make things right. And then came the proposal that changed everything. Howard asked me to take responsibility temporarily. He said with his connections, the charges would be reduced. He'd quietly return the money while I took a slap on the wrist. My reputation would take a hit, but I'd have their eternal gratitude and their daughter's hand in marriage. I could almost see it, a young man, ambitious, but also desperate for family, for belonging, facing an impossible choice. I agreed, he said, looking down at his hands. God help me, I agreed. But the night before I was supposed to make a statement, Caroline came to me crying. She told me her father had no intention of repaying the money or clearing my name. Once I confessed, I'd go to prison while they moved to Europe with what was left. The betrayal had broken something in him. That night, he'd packed a bag, withdrawn his savings, and disappeared. A trucker gave him a ride to Connecticut. He chose our town at random, created David Miller from fragments of his past, his middle name and his mother's maiden name, and started over with forged documents bought from a man the trucker knew. I thought about turning myself in every day that first year, he said. But the longer I waited, the harder it became. And then I met you, Elaine. His voice softened, and I recognized the man I knew in that tender change. Loving you wasn't a lie. Building this life with you has been the truest thing I've ever done. The letter, he explained, had come from a former colleague who tracked him down after Howard Wright's recent death. Caroline had finally confessed everything to clear her conscience, confirming Daniel's innocence. The statute of limitations on the financial crimes had expired, but there were other potential charges: identity fraud, evading investigation. I don't know what happens now, he finished. But I couldn't keep lying to you. Not another day. I sat in silence, 25 years of memories reshuffling themselves around this new reality. The man before me, both stranger and husband. Both liar and the love of my life. Did you ever plan to tell me? I finally asked. I convinced myself it was better for you not to know. That I was protecting you. He reached across the table, stopping short of touching my hand. But I was really protecting myself from losing you. I stood up, needing distance. Through the kitchen window, I could see our garden where spring bulbs were just beginning to push through soil we'd enriched together over decades. Everything in this house bore the imprint of our shared life: photographs, furniture we'd chosen together, the small imperfections we'd decided to live with rather than fix. I need time, I said, wrapping my cardigan tighter around myself. I need to think. That night, I slept in the guest room, surrounded by the quilts my grandmother had made. I thought about identity, how it's both fixed and fluid. I'd been Elaine Parker, then Elaine Wilson during my first marriage, then Elaine Miller. Each name had shaped me, but none defined me completely. Morning came with no clarity. I moved through the day in a fog, avoiding David's cautious attempts at conversation. My daughter called to chat about the twin school play, and I maintained normalcy through sheer force of will. By evening, something had crystallized within me, not a decision yet, but a question that demanded answering. I found David in his workshop, not working but sitting motionless before his tools. "Who are you now?" I asked from the doorway. "After all these years, are you David Miller or Daniel Morrison?" He looked up slowly, eyes red-rimmed from sleeplessness. "I'm the man who's loved you for 25 years. Beyond that, I honestly don't know anymore." 3 days after the revelation, I sat in a Philadelphia cafe across from Caroline Wright. Finding her had been surprisingly easy. She'd maintained her family's social prominence, sitting on charity boards and appearing in society pages. I hadn't told David I was coming. Some journeys need to be taken alone. Caroline was elegant at 60, with expertly colored blonde hair and the confident posture of a woman accustomed to being seen. Recognition flashed in her eyes when I introduced myself, not my name, but perhaps something in my determined stance. "You're Daniel's wife," she said softly. "He finally told you." For hours, she filled in the gaps of the story I'd heard from David. Her father's gambling addiction, her own complicity in the plan to sacrifice Daniel. Her decades of guilt, intensified after her father's deathbed confession. "I loved him once," she said, turning her coffee cup in manicured hands. "But not enough to choose him over my family, my lifestyle. I've had to live with that." "And now?" I asked. "What do you want now?" "Peace, I suppose. Forgiveness, though I don't deserve it. I've made a statement to the authorities clearing Daniel's name regarding the embezzlement. The other issues, his disappearance, the identity change, those are complicated. But I've hired attorneys to help navigate it. It's the least I can do." I studied her face, searching for deception and finding only regret. Why now, after all these years? My father died believing money and status were worth any sacrifice. I don't want to die with the same regrets. She hesitated. "Daniel was the best man I've ever known. He deserved better than what we did to him." Walking back to my hotel room, I felt the weight of others' choices, how they had shaped my life without my knowledge or consent. I had loved a man who didn't exist, yet the love itself had been real. The contradiction left me dizzy. In my room, I called David. When he answered, his voice was thick with worry. "I'm in Philadelphia," I said. A sharp intake of breath. Elaine, I met with Caroline today. She told me everything. Silence stretched between us, filled with 25 years of unspoken truths. Come home, he finally said. Please, whatever happens next, just come home first. The next morning, I visited the offices of Wright and Associates Architects, now run by Caroline's brother. The building David had once helped design still stood proud against the skyline. I wondered if walking these streets stirred memories for him, if he ever dreamed of the life he might have had. A security guard approached as I stood staring up at the building. Can I help you, ma'am? No, I said. I'm just remembering something that never happened. By the time I pulled into our driveway that evening, I'd made my decision. David was waiting on the porch, looking smaller somehow, diminished by exposure. I sat beside him on the steps we'd painted together just last summer. The air between us was heavy with possibility for devastation or renewal. I don't know if I can forgive the lies, I began. 25 years is a long time to live with someone else's secret. He nodded, accepting this without defense. But I do know this, I continued. The man who held my hand through chemotherapy, who taught our grandsons to build birdhouses, who brings me coffee every morning exactly how I like it, that man is real. Whether his name is David Miller or Daniel Morrison, he's the man I chose. I turned to face him fully, seeing both the stranger and the husband, both the lie and the truth. I didn't fall in love with a name. I fell in love with the way you see beauty in broken things, with how gently you move through the world despite your own wounds. That hasn't changed. Tears tracked silently down his weathered face. What happens now? Now we start over. With truth this time. Whatever comes, legal consequences, public exposure, we face it together. I reached for his hand, the one I'd held across a quarter-century of life. But first, I need to properly meet you. Hello, I'm Elaine Miller. And you are. He intertwined his fingers with mine, familiar calluses pressing against my palm. Daniel Morrison, he said, his voice breaking on the long-abandoned name. Though I'd like to remain David Miller if that's possible. He's become more real to me than Daniel ever was. Then that's who we'll be. David and Elaine Miller. Just with fewer secrets between us. As the sun set over our home of 23 years, casting long shadows across the yard where our grandchildren played, I understood something profound about love at this stage of life. It isn't the breathless passion of youth, or even the comfortable partnership of middle age. It's the choice to see someone completely, their failures, their cowardice, their capacity for deception, and still choose them, eyes wide open. 6 months later, we sat in a courtroom as David pleaded guilty to identity fraud. With Caroline's testimony and the evidence that he'd been falsely accused of the original crime, the judge was lenient, probation, community service, and a fine we could manage by selling our vacation cabin. The local paper ran the story. Local architect revealed to be fugitive from 90s financial scandal. For a few weeks, we endured the curious stares and whispered conversations that follow any small-town scandal. Friends called with awkward questions. My daughter was stunned but ultimately supportive after the initial shock. "Mom, are you sure about this?" she'd asked during a private moment. "You could walk away. No one would blame you." At 62, I know what matters, I told her, echoing words from a quarter century before. And it isn't what name appears on our mailbox. Gradually, life settled into new patterns. David, we decided to keep the name he'd lived with longer than his birth name, designed a community center pro bono as part of his service requirement. I volunteered there, teaching literacy classes to adults seeking second chances. On our 26th anniversary, we renewed our vows in our backyard. A smaller circle this time, just those who'd stood by us through the revelation and aftermath. My sister, who'd simply said, "Well, he's still the same fool who looks at you like you hung the moon." Our grandsons, now understanding just enough to know that grown-ups sometimes make mistakes and find redemption. My daughter and her husband, who'd processed their shock and chosen acceptance. As we spoke promises that meant something different now, honesty featuring prominently among them, I studied the face I'd woken up to for 26 years. The same laugh lines around his eyes, the same gentle hands that had built both buildings and a life with me. Different and yet the same. That night, after our small gathering had dispersed, we sat on the porch swing as we'd done countless evenings before. "Any regrets?" he asked, his shoulder warm against mine in the cool evening air. I thought about the question carefully. I regret that you carried this alone for so long. I regret the years you spent looking over your shoulder. But loving you? No. I don't regret a single day of that. He nodded, understanding what I wasn't saying too, that the pain of betrayal hadn't fully healed, that trust was still a tender, growing thing between us. When I became David Miller, I thought I was creating a fiction, he said quietly, watching fireflies rise from our garden. I didn't understand that we become what we practice. Day by day, choice by choice. The name was false, but the man I became with you, he's the truest version of myself I've ever known. I leaned my head against his shoulder, feeling the solid reality of him beside me. Maybe that's all any of us can hope for in the end. Not to be perfect, just to be real. Above us, stars emerged in the darkening sky, constant yet ever-changing, like the love that had sustained us through revelation and redemption. A love built not on flawless history, but on the choice to see each other clearly and stay anyway. I remember exactly where I was standing when my husband of 25 years became a stranger. And I know precisely where I was sitting when he became familiar again, but differently this time, with all his broken places exposed and all his courage visible. In our garden, beneath the open sky, holding the hand of a man whose name had changed, but whose heart still beat in rhythm with my own.